We have to start thinking about doing to oil something similar to what was done to salt in the late 19th century by electrification and refrigeration. Salt had a monopoly on meat preservation until up nearly the end of the 19th century. Believe it or not, countries fought wars over salt mines, and it mattered whether or not your country had salt. Today, nobody cares. Why? Because refrigeration is a much better way of preserving meat. Electricity made that possible, and nobody dominates his neighbor anymore because he has salt mines. We need to do the same thing to oil. We need not just to buy less foreign oil, but to undermine oil's monopoly on transportation and free oil to be bought and sold for all sorts of different purposes for which it's useful, and it's a good way to transport energy long distances. It's useful in chemical plants and home heating and so forth. But it doesn't dominate any of those markets. It doesn't have a monopoly, and we need to break its monopoly on transportation. On the malignant side of this divide between major problems that I've described, there are many ways in which complex systems can fail catastrophically from minor interruptions. Theorists sometimes call that the butterfly effect. Butterfly flutters its wings on one side of the world, cascading interactions in the ecosphere create a tornado on the other side. Seems kind of theoretical until you remember the tree branch falling in Cleveland 4 years ago. Well, climate change, I believe, is a problem somewhat like that. There are a number of effects in nature that, once one goes around a tipping point, can cascade in their failures. We don't know, I wouldn't say I know anyway, exactly when such a thing is going to occur, but one example is this. In the tundra of the Arctic, there is more carbon than there is in the atmosphere because the tundra is largely a giant frozen peat bog. Methane, which is the form of the chemical in which the carbon is about 22 times worse than CO2 as a global warming gas. So if it warms up enough in the Arctic that the tundra starts to melt, starts to release methane, the methane heats things up, in turn speeds up the release, in turn speeds up, and so forth, so-called feedback loop. One doesn't know when or exactly how it would occur, but the possibility of having a very major and negative development in climate over a relatively short period of time, a few decades, I believe exists. And it's that judgment, not so much the models that the climatologists produce, but judgment of people like James Hansen at NASA and the rest, that suggests to me that we ought to pay attention. It doesn't mean we know exactly when things are going to get warmer or exactly by how much. But if, to use the analogy I used before, if we are doing the society equivalent of smoking 5 packs a day, we can't tell we're going to get lung cancer at such and such an age, and we might live to be 95 and never get it, and we might have gotten it without ever smoking. But we're increasing our risk by smoking 5 packs a day, and I think that's the way we should think of the amount of carbon we are putting into the atmosphere. If we look at both of these needs, the need to deal with the climate change issues and disruption of the ecosphere, and the need to deal with the threats to our security from malevolent or intentional change, I think there are several things we should pay attention to. Sometimes when I do this, I do a little dialogue between the two individuals I'm going to name, but I don't think there's time to do that today, so I'm just going to touch on their issues. The dialogue I do is between a tree hugger and a hawk. The tree hugger is only worried about carbon and believes that anything about terrorism can be dealt with by the FBI if need be. The hawk is only worried about terrorism, and he thinks this climate change stuff is something that some bunch of Birkenstock wearers cooked up while they were having a good time one night or something. The tree hugger I use is the ghost of John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, father of the National Park System. The hawk is the ghost of George S. Patton. I use these two because they're two of my favorite Americans. And what I have them do is to get into a discussion of trying to deal with climate change and trying to deal with terrorism. And they find, as the discussion goes on, that they're able to agree about more and more in substance of what needs to be done, even though they never convince one another of the importance of their issue. Muir, for example, suggests that Walmart is doing an amazing job, as are some other companies, of radically reducing their energy use in existing buildings with just such changes as refrigerators and lights and skylights and so forth. Patton is very happy about that because it's less use of the grid, and Patton is very worried about our dependence on the electricity grid. He says that, the Maginot Line was at least defensible from one direction. The electricity grid isn't defensible at all the way it's structured now. Muir mentions California. He says that, 20 years ago, California changed its rules for utilities. It decoupled revenue from earnings for utilities and said that from now on, you make money as a utility by investing, including sometimes in energy savings equipment and technology. You don't make more money by building more power plants and selling the electricity, even if it's wasted. And by the way, what that has done is it's kept California's per capita consumption of electricity absolutely flat over the course of the last 20 years, and the rest of the country has gone up 60%. Some 6 other states have now followed California on the electricity side, and a few more on the natural gas side of this decoupling. It's a simple, straightforward change for utilities that can make a huge amount of difference. A third point that Muir raises is Denmark. Because the Danes make over a third of their electricity out of something called combined heat and power, or cogeneration. In Denmark, if one of our guests here, if John owned a coking plant on one side of the road and I owned an aluminum plant on the other, he would simply put in some generators, string a wire across the road, and sell me the electricity cheaply to make aluminum. In Europe, particularly in Denmark, that is encouraged, and so it's waste that is being used, heat that would just go into the atmosphere. In the United States, that's very hard. Public utility commissions make that very, very difficult to do, and it's one of the reasons that Europe is ahead of us in using this type of distributed generation, because these steps are permitted in Europe and they are very rarely permitted in the United States. Muir also talks about rooftops. He says, do you realize what is happening just among people who are doing photovoltaics and batteries? Photovoltaics are getting cheaper, not quite as fast as Moore's law of doubling their capacity every 18 months to 2 years, but they're doubling their capacity about every 3 to 4 years. And they are getting much more efficient, and the same thing is happening to batteries. We are already, again, in California in a situation where in many parts of the state you can buy electricity from your roof from a company that will put up photovoltaics cheaper than you can get it from the grid. California's utility prices are about double the rest of the country, but that condition, so-called grid parity, will probably come to be close to the case in much of the rest of the country over the course of the next 3 to 4 years.